Quinta, while I'm delighted to hear that you finally saw Dune, I am appalled that you saw it on an airplane screen, and therefore the climactic scenes with the sandworms was like, the sandworms were 2 inches. How could you?
I will say I watched Oppenheimer on my phone on an airplane.
Oh, wow.
So this is not the first of my crimes against cinema. I will say, as with Oppenheimer, I feel like it allowed me to identify some of the flaws with the film, which I otherwise might not have noticed, such as the script sucks. Wow,
Whoa.
that is a terrible script.
Hot
it is just,
take.
as you know, Bob, straight through. The visuals, amazing. The politics, possibly the weirdest thing I have ever seen. The script is bizarre.
Was the problem the script or the source material?
I don't know. I haven't read the book.
Wait, this is important. Who has read the actual Dune series?
I mean, I read the first. So, my God. I started off by roasting Quinta, and
I was going to say, that is an Alan calling the Quinta.
I think of Dune like I think of Lord of the Rings, which is to say, I read the first 200 pages of the first book, and then got so bogged down in its just turgidity, like just the sheer kind of molasses-like quality of the detail after detail that I never finished it. So, yeah, I'm an asshole, I think, in conclusion.
I wasn't going to say it, but I can one-up you there. Yeah, thinking it so hard. So my wife and I, we were driving in the middle of nowhere, Montana, and we're like, you know what? Let's just listen to Dune. And all of a sudden,
I'm sorry. You were both like, or was this your idea? Don't drag your wife in. Just 100% don't throw your wife under the bus on this one. We decided, quote unquote.
We decided she's the passenger princess. I said, buckle up. I've got to drive. Here we go. We're going to do Dune. It's going to be wonderful. The number of times I almost fell asleep and drove straight into a cow was just...
Yeah, I think the takeaway is just watch the beautiful images. Don't think about the script. Don't think about the politics, which are that fascism is good, but also bad. Don't think about it.
It's complicated, Q. It's complicated.
Pretty pictures. This is gonna be a theme. You gotta see Twisters. So many pretty pictures.
Oh my God.
Glenn Powell.
This is your first of, okay. Kevin, I am giving you 3 Twisters references. You are allowed 3. You have used one of your 3 Twisters references for this episode, my friend.
Oh, geez. Well, this will be exciting for everyone, is to see if I get kicked off the show for too many Twisters references.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rational Security, the Big Worm Energy edition. I am one of your co-hosts, Quinta Jurassic, and I am here with my other co-host, Ellen Rosenstein.
Hello.
And we are Scottless this week, but we do have another special guest, Kevin Frazier. Hello, Kevin.
In the words of Glenn Powell, howdy.
That's 2. That's your second out of 3 Twisters references. I didn't say Twisters. Nah, the reference was applied. You said, let's be clear, it was Glenn Powell. You were clearly doing Glenn Powell in Twisters for the howdy. So yeah, nice try.
All right.
Well, we are here today to talk about tech policy, the Supreme Court, and Glenn Powell, apparently. Our topics for this week: Cosa Nostra. An overwhelming majority of senators voted this week to pass the Kids Online Safety Act, also known as COSA, a bipartisan piece of legislation that would impose new responsibilities on online platforms and looking after their underage users. But despite the vote in the Senate, COSA has faced strong opposition from a number of civil rights and internet freedom groups, and its path ahead in the House remains uncertain. What's next for the bill, and what does its success so far say about the state of tech policy in the U.S.? Our second topic, herding llamas. The company formerly known as Facebook announced the release of a new AI large language model, Llama 3.1. Meta described the model as open source, but is it responsible to release such a powerful model that way? And what does this mean for the AI arms race in Silicon Valley? And our third topic, keeping the 9 in line. Fresh on the heels of the Supreme Court's ruling granting presidents broad immunity from criminal prosecution, President Biden announced his support for a slate of reforms aimed squarely at the court, a constitutional amendment ruling out presidential immunity, along with 18-year term limits and a binding code of conduct for Supreme Court justices. But any of these proposals would face a difficult road toward implementation. What's the White House's aim here? For the first topic, Kevin, I will hand it over to you.
All right. So digging into the weeds of COSA, let's start with the basics. First, what's the meta-narrative around this bill? We've long heard that the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPA, is out of date. But how is COSA supposed to be an improvement? What were the political trends and pressures that led to COSA even coming to the fore to begin with? Let's start with Quinta.
Yeah, so COSA has had a long and winding road to get here. I believe it was first introduced in 2022 by a bipartisan duo of senators, Blumenthal and Marsha Blackburn. And it's been through a number of revisions since then, including one sort of final round of revisions that produced the bill that the Senate actually voted on, which I will confess I'm kind of still looking through to figure out which way is up. What I would argue is that what this bill kind of comes out of is a surge of interest in focusing tech policy reform specifically on child safety legislation that really follows the Facebook files revelations that came from the Frances Haugen leaks and Haugen's testimony before the Senate in 2021. And after that, you just see this real tidal wave of interest, not only in Congress, but in state legislatures across the country, both blue and red, in pushing forward on child safety legislation. So the sort of flagship proposal of the bill here is what's called a duty of care, sort of a level of additional responsibility that's assigned to platforms for sort of looking after their younger users. I would argue, and I wrote about this in March when it last seemed like the bill was going to come to a vote and started attracting all of these co-sponsors, that a lot of this I think comes from a legitimate concern over child safety online, and we can talk about that. But a lot of it is a way of kind of shunting attention away from Section 230 reform, because it turns out that Section 230 reform is hard. And everyone kind of wants it, but can't agree on what it is. And so child safety is this sort of way to kind of take on this same project of tech reform without getting snarled up in a lot of those difficulties about, like, how do you actually reform it? What does reforming it do? The problem, and again, I argued this in March, and I think it's very much still true with the current version of the bill, is that child safety reform, and I'm putting air quotes around this, is also hard, because what children are we talking about? How are we keeping them safe? What are we keeping them safe from? What does reform look like? Is really difficult. And you see that in some of the strange bedfellows that have opposed and supported this bill, some of the concerns about whether it could be used against, LGBTQ teens looking for resources online. And so while there was this sort of surge of interest in the Senate and it got overwhelming support, it seems like it is now maybe facing a harder road in the House. And so I'll be very interested to see whether we kind of follow the road that we saw with the last big, and I think even more misconceived, tech reform, Sesta Fosta, where it kind of was steamrolled through, and then only afterward do people kind of take a look back and say, ooh, maybe that was not a great idea. Or whether the House is going to take a little longer on this one, and whether we might see some of those sort of competing dynamics between parties and factions create problems for the bill moving forward.
And Alan, as a father of two future social media users, I'm keen to hear.
Don't remind.
I'm just. What's fascinating to me about COSA is not only the outgrowth from the Facebook files, as Quinta pointed out, but I think also seeing this parent movement that we saw form maybe in COVID kind of come to the fore. But now we're seeing it manifest in very strange ways. We've got the ACLU in opposition to this bill. We've got the Patriot Voices, a group formed by former Senator Rick Santorum, in opposition to the bill. And then a whole lot of parents who are just angry and just want things to change. So, Alan, where do you kind of see this political moment going with respect to these two oppositional forces, and why are we seeing this strange alignment of different groups?
So, I mean, I was laughing about, like, my kids, thank God, are very, very young. And so I have, many years, hopefully, before I have to deal with this. But it's actually true that I actually do think that my thinking on this has actually changed because I'm a parent. And it's not because I think that, like, I have any particularly better wisdom on the policy issues because I happen to be a parent. I'm not a child psychologist. But maybe it's just made me more sensitive to the fact that, like, oh my God, I'm going to have to deal with this problem in some number of years. And I have, in part because of the Facebook files, but also just because of everything we know about Silicon Valley and just capitalism, frankly, which generally I am quite a fan of. I have no faith that these giant, public companies that exist through the extraction of our data and our attention and our neuroses and our negativity, that they can be trusted to act reasonably with respect to us and in particular with respect to our children. And so while I'm in no way blind to or unsympathetic to the critics of COSA, and we can get into sort of all the potential problems there, I think this is an example where, what's the alternative? Right? Is it just going to be the status quo? Is it just going to be, little stuff like, increasing transparency or increasing the privacy default for minors, all of which is good stuff and we should do it anyway. But is that really enough, right? I mean, this is the problem with public policy. You're often dealing with trade-offs. You're often dealing with uncertain information, and not acting is a form of acting. And, I think that, and again, I don't want to be like, I am a parent and therefore I have some wisdom, but it just is the case that if this is the sort of thing that for whatever reason you're concerned about, either because you are a parent or because you're just concerned about it, because, you're allowed to be concerned about whatever you want to be concerned about, the status quo seems really, really, really problematic. And the answer of, well, let's just empower parents and let's just, help them take responsibility, I just think is helpful because social media in particular is such a collective action problem. Because, and this is true for, this kind of issue, this stuff, this is true for stuff like, phones in schools. I think of all of these as part of the same kind of complex of issues. Whether you're a child who wants to opt out of this or a concerned parent, it's really not helpful to have to do it by yourself, because then, your child is particularly disadvantaged because they're not part of these communities. And so you need some sort of collective action. And in the absence of voluntary collective action, which you're just not going to get from Silicon Valley, frankly, there's just no reason to expect that self-regulation will work. You need some sort of top-down regulation, right? And I am more than happy to consider many alternatives to COSA, but no one has yet articulated what an actual meaningful alternative would be that is responsive to the main concerns, right? Which is why, like, if I was a senator, I don't know if we mentioned it, but it was a 97-3 vote. It was something insane. 93-3.
91 to 3.
91. Okay. So I guess some senators didn't vote. But I mean, it was overwhelming. I mean, I would have been one of those 91 senators, right? I don't think I would have been like super, super excited with my vote, but I think I would have definitely been part of that vote. As to what the politics on this are, it's interesting. The civil society, a lot of the civil society groups are coming out against this for the sort of standard civil society reasons. And I'm not in any way criticizing that when I say standard civil society. They're like the standard free speech and First Amendment concerns and all of that, right? And then there might be also concerns about specific subpopulations, right? So Quinta highlighted, and this has been correctly a topic of conversation, of the potential effect on LGBTQ kids who can both be harmed by social media, but also in some ways can benefit from social media. You have kind of an interesting, conservative groups are some sort of split. Some of them really like this bill. Some of them don't like it because they don't think it goes far enough. A lot of the changes to the bill came from earlier versions would have empowered like state attorneys generals to come in and enforce the law, which raised a lot of concerns about, in particular, conservative attorney general, using that to try to restrict access to LGBTQ information, though one could imagine some version of that on the left as well. The latest version of the bill, the main enforcer is the FTC, which, I mean, sort of takes this out of politics. Obviously doesn't really take it out of politics because obviously, who's in the White House gets to decide who's the head of the FTC. And it's not like the current FTC commissioner is like a super bipartisanly loved figure. Though again, that's not a criticism of her. It's just the nature of politics today. So I think that's where some of the politics come through. I mean, I think the question that I have, and I'm curious, especially what you, Quinta, think, is given how overwhelmingly this passed in the Senate, and given that it's not like I think Silicon Valley is much more loved in the House than in the Senate, I'm not sure why the narrative has been that, well, it passed in the Senate, but there's very little chance of it passing in the House. Like, why isn't there a big chance of it passing in the House? I mean, the makeup of the House and the Senate, I mean, it's different, but if you can get a 91-3 vote in the Senate, like, is it going to be that different in the House ultimately?
Yeah, I think it is. And I mean, to be clear, I don't actually know what the latest reporting is, but there has been reporting. It's not just like, oh, things are different in the House. There is concrete reporting about how the nature of the different factions in the House, we
need Molly Reynolds here.
Well, no, I mean, I think it has to do, there are specific facts on the ground in terms of who is pushing what legislation, what personalities are involved that have led reporters to conclude that the path ahead seems harder in the House. I will confess that I'm no longer up to date on this because the last time that I was really, really deep in this was March, and obviously the situation has changed. But tech reporters who I trust have said that it just seems like the situation is different, possibly because of these sort of weird shifting coalitions, possibly because the groups that oppose it for a variety of reasons have been able to gain more ground in the House, possibly just because, legislators can be territorial and somebody wants their bill instead of this other bill. I really don't know, but it does seem like the path ahead is less clear than it was in the Senate, where the bill just picked up this terrific sort of, snowballing of sponsors.
Yeah, I mean, that all makes sense. I mean, at the same time, I will say, and I suspect you'd agree with me, that ultimately this stuff is very unpredictable, right? I mean, take the TikTok bill, for example, which was going places, then it was dead for a while, then it was added to a thing, and then it had to be passed, and then it was suddenly passed. So that's the weird thing about stuff like this. This could be COSA was passed in the Senate, it dies in the House, and you never hear from it again, or a month from now, it's signed into law. And, the first challenges are filed in federal court. It could be anything in between.
I mean, I don't know, right? The thing is with the House, there is such a narrow majority for Republicans in the House that you really need to keep everybody aligned. And I don't know what the Democratic caucus looks like on COSA. I will say that there has been a real shift in terms of from FOSTA SESTA. There was a really impressive lobbying effort by sex workers and by advocates in that space, sort of arguing that this legislation, which pared back 230 immunity, would lead to a real silencing of voices and stripping away of resources that were necessary for that community to keep them safe. I think that experience with SESTA FOSTA has led LGBT groups to really take this issue and run with it, and that the specific way that this bill is focused around kids and child safety plays very nicely into an issue that the Democrats have really tried to make their own, which is, protecting LGBT kids in a time when in many jurisdictions there's increasingly a sort of Republican hostility in a variety of ways. And so you can tell a story where in an election year, this group is able to kind of take that issue and make it too difficult for Democrats to push forward with, even though you could also say, if you just frame it as child safety, everyone loves child safety as long as it's in the abstract, that maybe it could be pushed forward. So I really don't know. It'll be interesting to watch. I mean, I think I've hinted at this already, but I'm not a fan of this legislation. I don't particularly like it. I don't think there's a better solution out there, which is why I think that it's actually important to legislate transparency measures and access to data at a time when platforms are increasingly closing that off, just because we don't know what interventions will help. And so right now, I just worry that this is sort of, shooting in the dark in a way that's ultimately not productive.
Yeah, and just on that last point, it was worth flagging. And again, this is an admission against interest, as they say, because I do think this is a big issue and needs to be legislated against. The data on the effect of social media on the mental health of teenagers and young children, it's just unclear, right? You can. There are a lot of good researchers on both sides. I'm a big Jonathan Haidt fan, and he tells me stuff I agree with. So I want to believe him, and I'm sure he's a good researcher, but I'm not a statistician. And there are plenty of smart people who think that, they cut his data in different ways and they find much smaller effects. The effects are for different subpopulations. It'd be nice if we could say social media is like smoking or something like that, but it's just not. And so, there's as usual, a kind of meta question of how do you do policymaking under conditions of this kind of empirical uncertainty? And of course, one response is to say, well, do more research. But of course, it's
not very satisfying.
Yeah. And as I tell my students who do writing projects for me, you can't just keep reading. At some point, you just have to do something. And maybe this is where giving the FTC authority is a good idea. Though one would have to know more about how the FTC would actually use that authority. What you need is not a piece of legislation that resolves the issue in one fell swoop, but you have to set up a kind of piecemeal regulatory regime that over 5 years, 10 years, 15 years can do the kind of small incremental steps necessary to figure this out, like we would any other policy issue that has technical elements like pollution or health or environmental quality. But we shall see.
To the point of doing quality research, though, on empirical interventions, I do want to quickly shout out the Pro-Social Design Network. I mean, there are a group of folks looking at these different interventions you can impose on platforms and test the effects they're going to have on the quality of the discourse. And those interventions are empirically tested. They're run through studies. Those are things that we could look to for suggestions for how to improve social media use by kids. But without getting too much into the statistical weeds, let's dive into a different set of weeds, which is the legal weeds. The facts on the ground have changed substantially since the initial introduction of KOSA with respect to the Supreme Court's approach to content moderation, the First Amendment, and all of these weighty questions. So, Alan, in the wake of Moody and some of the other comments we've seen from the justices, whether in plurality opinions, concurrences, wandering dissents, what is your interpretation of how a First Amendment challenge to KOSA would come out? Or what are some of the major factors that would be relevant in that inquiry?
So just as a reminder, Net Choice v. Moody is the recent Supreme Court opinion that came out, I think, last month about the Texas and Florida social media content moderation laws. So in that case, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the way that the challengers brought their lawsuit, which was a facial challenge to the entire law rather than as applied, was a problem. And then they split on what actually to do on the merits once this was on remand. The reason I actually mentioned the facial versus as applied part is because I think that's actually really important. The only thing that Moody actually established as a matter of like actual law, right, which is the holding, is that these kinds of facial challenges are going to be difficult for companies to bring. And I think it's actually really important because I think that if KOSA were to be enacted, or if there were to be a state KOSA, and there are plenty of kind of state versions of this floating around. I think California has like a child design code. I mean, other states have this, and lots of states will pass stuff like this without question. The approach of the companies and the trade associations like Net Choice that represent them to go and say, just strike this whole thing down and get some district court to issue a injunction, I think is not going to work anymore because these laws are they're very large. They have lots of pieces. They apply to lots of different things. And so I think that once a law like this is enacted, you're going to get challenges and probably some parts of the law might get struck down, but it's going to be piece by piece. And so I think that's important. I think it's good actually, because I think it allows the law to develop in a better way. And I think it's also emboldening to legislators because I think they now know that if they pass something, even if some of it is struck down, it's unlikely that all of it is going to be struck down. So I think that's a useful thing. And that is like a 9-0 holding from the Supreme Court in Net Choice v. Moody. As to the actual substantive question, Moody, I mean, as we talked about on the Ratzig a few weeks ago, it's a very hard decision to parse. I mean, technically you have a 5-justice majority for some dicta about how social media content moderation is First Amendment protected as a general matter. Now, again, how exactly that plays out is a little unclear. There are probably some sort of very specific cases, of human content moderation decisions that are just First Amendment protected. But even there's some doubt about what about purely algorithmic moderation. And at the end of the day, it's important. That's all dicta anyway. So like none of this is actually binding on the Supreme Court when this comes back up in a few years. But even if you take on faith, and I think it's true that, the Tornillo decision from the 1970s, I think, does apply in some general way to content moderation decisions. It's actually still extremely unclear how that would apply in a KOSA-like case for two reasons. First, the First Amendment applies just very differently to children than it does to adults. Children just have fewer First Amendment rights, and children here just like defined as under 18 have fewer First Amendment rights. The closer they get to 18, the more First Amendment rights they have, but they do have fewer First Amendment rights. And concomitantly, adults and corporations have fewer First Amendment rights to speak to children than they have to speak to each other. So that's part of the analysis. Now, it's also true that a standard way that courts analyze child safety laws that impinge on speech is to ask what the spillover effect would be on the speech of adults. Because one concern about a law like KOSA is, even if you think it's going to work perfectly with respect to the children, the amount of censorship, filtering, moderation, whatever you want to call it, that the companies are going to do in order to not run afoul of it with respect to children is going to inevitably affect the way that adults use the internet, especially if you have like age verification laws. Now, there's actually another case that's going to be heard. I mean, this the last couple of years has just been amazing for like digital First Amendment people like me. It's amazing. There's another case that's going to be heard this upcoming term about Texas's age verification requirement for pornography sites. I think it's called Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton. I think I may be getting it wrong. But that's actually going to tell us a lot about whether a law like KOSA can survive, because there the concern is not, children have a First Amendment right to pornography. It's that adults have a First Amendment right to pornography. And that's going to be excessively burdened by this age verification thing. So that's part of it. The other reason that net choice, the Moody decision, is still uncertain is even those justices that is justices like Justice Kagan and the Chief Justice and Justice Kavanaugh, that were not a fan of the state social media laws. They didn't like them because they were concerned about the reason, in particular, the state was trying to limit content moderation, which was trying to impose some sort of ideological balance. That's not the case here. Like that's not what KOSA is trying to do. It is trying to affect speech, but for a specific child safety rationale. And in fact, Justice Kagan, in her majority opinion, calls out that, look, maybe child safety is a different thing. So I think there's no question that there's some serious First Amendment stuff here, and that this will be litigated as it should be on First Amendment grounds. But how exactly that will work out is totally unclear.
Well, I think it's particularly interesting to see the nexus of some of the things we've been discussing, where the more we have empirical research on the effects of different content exposure to kids, arguably the more compelling the interest will be for the states to have some sort of regulatory intervention to protect kids. So I guess this is all to say much more to come on the KOSA question.
Well, let's talk about one social media company in particular, Meta. They have unveiled a new version of their Llama large language model. It is Llama 3.1. It is open source, and I confess I still don't 100% know what that means. And this is controversial for reasons that I would love for both of you to explain to me.
Well, so thankfully, as Chinny Sharma and Jonathan Arbel pointed out in a podcast a few weeks ago, there's a spectrum of open source. And so even though Zuck has apparently in his new hot Zuck phase, I don't know if everyone's aware of the tanned and curled.
It is so weird. It is so.
I find the necklace to be
so weird.
It's the necklace that I find.
The necklace is
strange.
What takes it into like outright uncanny valley.
To be, I was debating whether or not to wear my cowboy hat in respect for Glenn Powell or my gold chain, but then I realized I don't have a gold chain, so that issue was off. And I
3 out of 3. That's your last Glenn Powell Twisters reference.
Okay. Well, so hot Zuck aside, I think it's really interesting, actually, some of the reporting on the open source discourse here. So generally, when we're talking about open source, we think about open source software, which generally has positive connotations about making sure that different software is code is available for folks to test on, to democratize access to code and different resources. And in an AI context, though, there are some folks predominantly in the AI safety community who worry about open source models being distributed and perhaps used by bad actors to achieve nefarious ends. Whether or not Llama 3.1 is open source is kind of a hot debate. So Zuckerberg appears to be emphasizing that it is an open source model, perhaps to distinguish Meta from OpenAI, from Anthropic, as a sort of, look, we're with the little guy, which usually isn't a narrative that Meta can lean on very hard. But in actuality, I think a more accurate description is that it's an open weight model. So to be truly open source, you have to share things like the data it was trained on, for example, which is something that Meta is not doing. So that technical nuance aside, I think that this is a really, really big deal that Llama 3.1 is performing in a similar fashion on some of the key benchmarks as the closed models that we see from OpenAI and Anthropic. And it's going to change the discourse around what is the future of OpenAI, what is the future of Anthropic, and what is the future of Meta in this AI space. Some really interesting debates have been happening around whether or not this is Zuckerberg trying to essentially undercut OpenAI and deny it a path to a profitable future, which I think is a pretty good take. If you think about the fact that when Meta released Llama 3.1, they had a lot of big partners come out and say, we're using this on our sites in our enterprise fashion, and we're going to lean on this in a big way. Well, those were clients that I'm sure OpenAI was hoping would be theirs, and opportunities that OpenAI was looking for. So this is going to be a new era, I think, for open source and for the future of AI.
Yeah. So on the open source thing, so I think that for the reasons most people care about whether a model is open source or not, in particular the safety questions, this is 100% open source. And here's it's open source in the way that matters. Because here's the reason. A model that is open weight, which is what Llama is, which is to say the 415 or however many billion parameters of the model, the things that actually determine what output you get for a given input, those are open, which is like, there's like some, I don't know, it's not a text file presumably, but like there's some file with those. The reason that's important is because that allows anyone to run it locally, but more importantly, it allows anyone to fine tune it. So you can take that, start with the Llama 3.1 model and then tweak it. And in particular, you can tweak it to remove whatever safety protocols and safety safeguards Meta put on that model. Now, it is true that it's not open source in the sense that the data that it was trained on is not open source, but I'm not sure how relevant that actually is, because even if you had the data, you still have to train the model. You still have to, which is to say you'd have to use however many hundreds of millions of dollars of compute resources to train that. But presumably, if you actually already have the compute resources, you probably are in a pretty good position to collect the data anyway. So it's that the marginal openness of letting someone who doesn't already have the capabilities to create a foundation model start with a really powerful model and then tweak them in potentially nefarious ways. That exists. And so I think that this debate of whether this is truly open or not, while like an important, interesting debate, among like machine learning people, for the policy implications of the openness, I think is not that relevant. This is an open source model in all the ways that it matters.
I do think folks who are more technical than me would say, to the extent that we're concerned about, your average Joe taking Llama 3.1 and fine-tuning it and jailbreaking it to achieve some creation of a bioweapon, it is important to point out that to fine-tune a model with 405 billion parameters, you've got it. It's not like you pull up your Chromebook and say, you know what, this is my moment. I'm going to fine-tune this model and create whatever.
Look, we've all done linear algebra in high school.
Exactly. Well, so that is the one thing that I think needs to be included in this discourse is, even if we were to label it as open source and say that we can have a broader distribution of this model in comparison to something like OpenAI, it's still not your average Joe or Jane who just decides today's the day I jailbreak Llama 3.1. So from a risk point of view, I think that's something really important to point out. I do think that paying attention to the stories on how OpenAI is doing from a funding point of view and from a investor point of view is going to be a really big deal, because some folks were anticipating that we would have seen something like ChatGPT 5 relatively soon. And relatively soon just keeps being relatively soon. And we've yet to see this 5, which is apparently going to be legendary. It just hasn't shown up. And instead, we've gotten these slight improvements trickle out over a couple of months. But the fact that Llama 3.1 is here, is open source in the way that matters, as Alan said, I think is going to disrupt the industry quite a bit.
Yeah, it suggests that the moat that a lot of people thought OpenAI had does not actually exist. And in particular, as these foundation models all seem to kind of converge together, it's just not clear that OpenAI, which does not have Meta's kind of infinite pockets, will necessarily be able to compete. And if it does, of course, and maybe we can use this again in a conversation about safety, if it does, it's going to have to do so in a very aggressive way to release features and to push the frontier, which like maybe you think is good from an innovation perspective. But given that the whole reason OpenAI exists is to you build artificial general intelligence in a quote unquote responsible way, that's a concern. And not to pick on OpenAI, all this applies to Anthropic too, right? Anthropic, I think, has been a little more responsible than OpenAI. But well, again, they're going to have the same competitive pressures that OpenAI has. And so we'll see how long their more conservative approach lasts.
And one other key feature to highlight about Llama 3.1 is its UI, and the way it's sort of been trained and set up for use is to enable greater AI agent development, which is going to be the thing we'll be talking about. What could go wrong? We're going to be talking about this a lot.
For the dummies among us, what does that actually mean?
Definitely no dummies at RATSEC. So that's good. That's good news. First things first.
Or maybe only dummies at RATSEC. It's one of the two.
Only dummies and Glenn Powell fans.
Oh, okay. That's it. Penalty. Got a 1 demerit to Hufflepuff.
So AI agents, not only, so traditionally when you go and scroll up ChatGPT, for example, you have to prompt it. You have to ask, hey, ChatGPT, can you do this for me? Soon we'll become much more accustomed to using AI agents that are taking action on your behalf. They only have to be prompted once. You give them a set of directions. And even then they may take more or less seemingly autonomous actions on your behalf. So you say, book that hotel room for me. If you talk to some folks, well, let's say that AI agent finds out your hotel is booked. Well, if it's not adequately trained, this is the doomsday approach to AI agents. Well, that AI agent may go and kill the people who were staying in that hotel. And suddenly, there's a lot of vacancy at the inn, right? So that is the kind of worst case paperclip scenario.
The worst case scenario is if it can't kill those people and you don't get the hotel room. That's obviously the much worse scenario. I mean, you ask the AI to do something for you, right? What kind of an assistant is this? Show some initiative.
But this is really, I think Llama 3.1 is going to become perhaps the foundation of a lot of these AI agents. And that future is going to change a lot of the way we kind of interact with one another and in particular interact with AI. So lots to come from there too.
Yeah. Kevin's AI will send me long emails with Glenn Powell references and my AI will delete them immediately without me having to read them. It's perfect.
So there's been a lot of debate about whether or not releasing a model with these capabilities in this way is irresponsible or not. Again, for those of us in the room without a background in this, why would it be irresponsible? And then what do you make of that critique?
Yeah. So, I mean, the reason it'd be irresponsible is, I mean, a lot of things we've already talked about, which is that if you think that these models, either in their current form or especially as they get more advanced, can do bad things either because they enable bad actors to do bad things, or in the kind of more science fiction-y scenario, but that's maybe not that science fiction-y, they become highly agentic, and they act on their own and do bad things. Then releasing an open source version of it, which is inherently less controllable because it can be downloaded anywhere, it can be run anywhere, it can be retrained so as to strip out whatever safety features have been put in there, is potentially irresponsible. And that's been, the big concern over open source models. Now, whatever you think about the Meta's decision, Meta and Zuckerberg have clearly thought about this very carefully. And in rolling out 3.1, Zuckerberg released an extremely interesting, like really worth reading very carefully, very thoughtful, hardly unimpeachable, but like very thoughtful, long blog post on why he thinks that open source is the future of AI, why it's good for the United States, why it's good for U.S. national security, and also why some of the concerns are overblown. And I think the core of it, and here I am tempted to agree, is this. And let me make the kind of the another meta point, because this is all right, policy making under conditions of uncertainty. We don't know. I mean, AI is so new, and these kinds of models are so new. We don't really know what we're doing. But we have to act. We have to act in one way or the other. So we make these decisions. How do we make these decisions? Well, we can look to the past and look for analogies. And there is, in fact, actually a very strong analogy here with respect to other kinds of open source software. So, in the 80s and 90s, there was this big debate, both within the, academic and the engineering communities, and also in the government, about whether or not open source software was more or less secure. I mean, this came in lots of forms, right? Part of it was just, if it's open source, lots of people can find can find exploits to it, and then maybe therefore it's less secure. On the other hand, people argue that if it's open source, you can have more eyeballs on it, and therefore you can find stuff. And there were similar kind of concerns with government on whether or not, let's say, encryption software should be open source or not. This is the sort of first crypto wars of the 1990s. And I think the conclusion from that period is that the open source advocates were almost completely correct. Not literally 100%, but that the flourishing of open source has actually led not only to America's technological dominance, but to a lot of really good and really secure software. Because as it turns out, having just more eyeballs on software tends to make it more secure. And even if that software can then get into the hands of bad actors, having an open source ecosystem can let the defenders have even better defenses to it, right? So, and again, based on that, I think it's not unreasonable. And I myself probably would, if I had to choose, fall on the open source side of things for generative AI. And I think it's especially true now where we're in a generation where the models are getting very complex, they're getting very impressive, they're getting very interesting, but they're not actually dangerous yet. Like Llama 3.1 or even GPT-5 is probably not going to really increase the sort of catastrophic risk that people are worried about. Like GPT-7 might, but like no one thinks, I think, even GPT-5, maybe even GPT-6 won't. I mean, we don't know. We don't know. But it's certainly true that like Llama 3.1 is not going to end the world. And so there's an argument for, making Llama 3.1 open source, because then we can use this as an opportunity to see, to as a community figure out how to best take advantage of the benefits of open source for still a fundamentally limited model. And maybe we can use those lessons going forward. The real question, right, is at what point does the past no longer become a useful predictor of the future? And the whole point of AI is that when you look at the kind of double exponential growth curves and potential singularities and just how crazy all of this is, it could be that the past lessons of open source are really valuable until one day they're not. And if you think that the risk is existential, like you only need to screw up once for the game to be over. So while again, if I had to choose, I'm still on team open source. I recognize that could change at any moment. And I also recognize why people who I think are generally a little more worried about the AI safety issues than I am. And I'm very curious, Kevin, what you think, because I sort of tend to put you in that category when you not talk about this. I could totally imagine and respect why they'd be like, yeah, I'm not screwing around with that. Right? Because I think the downside risk is too great. And the problem with downside risk is like, once you go bankrupt, you're done. Right? Like there's no do-over from, once Skynet wakes up.
And I think you're spot on, Alan, that right now, Llama 3.1 won't end the world in the right hands. And that's a big caveat. And I'm not saying it's going to end the world necessarily, but
do you think it would even end the world in the wrong hands?
Well, so I'm saying the fact that, and this is the context that is hard to cover in a short podcast, is the national security ramifications of having an open source model now being available to our adversaries, and adversaries that perhaps aren't as sophisticated without having this sort of open source model become available. So thinking right now about how AI is already being used by Russia, China, the Houthis, like if we see these advanced models become available to adversaries, I do think that is the most compelling safety argument against open sourcing, is being able to jailbreak a 3.1, Llama 3.1, and use it, for example, toward engineering a bioweapon at some point, right? And so let's say it's not 3.1. Let's say I give you that. Is it 3.2? Right? Like, how do we know? And this is your point about downside risks. How do we know? And that part is scary to me. I do think the answer, or a very strong counter argument, is we'll never know. And so our best response is just the traditional responses to, for example, bioweapon resilience, right? Continue to just invest in the defenses we would already have in cyber attack resilience, for example. And I do think the pro of open source that also Zuck was really careful to point out, and Meta has been careful to tout, is now we're seeing some of the positive use cases of AI that perhaps have been missing. So now with Llama 3.1, we can think about those nonprofits, admittedly larger nonprofits, but those nonprofits creating that AI agent to address educational needs for kids with certain learning disabilities. Now we could see certain hospitals or medical facilities maybe leaning more into AI to detect certain illnesses and things like that. So that to me is a really strong point, is we've yet to see maybe as many of the positive use cases of AI as we've been hoping for. I mean, planning a trip is nice, but if we can detect cancer faster or help kids read good, yes, I said read good intentionally. Shout out to
you're allowed, to be clear, you're allowed an infinite number of Zoolander references. There's no limit to how many Zoolander references you can put in.
For listeners, I am making the most accurate blue steel face you've ever seen before.
It's working for me, man.
So I do think those positive use cases have to be included in this calculus, and they generally have been missing, in my opinion. When we see folks attack kind of open source, we're not getting a nuanced analysis of just how much good we can see come about from their use from good actors, for lack of a better phrase.
Well, moving from a bunch of interesting high-tech 21st century concerns to stuff that I really wish the framers had figured out in the late 18th century, let's talk about Supreme Court reform. So President Biden, although no longer in the running for the 2024 election, he's not done doing stuff. He announced in a public event and a Washington Post op-ed, is an interesting venue. I'm curious what the implications of that, if any, are. His proposal for some Supreme Court reform. And he suggested three in particular. One, a constitutional amendment that would overturn the Supreme Court's recent decision in Trump versus United States regarding presidential immunity. The second is 18-year term limits for justices. I think it's unclear whether that would require, I don't think he specified whether that would be done through a constitutional amendment or statute. There have been some clever statutory suggestions on how to do that. And then finally, an enforceable code of ethical conduct for the justices. This is clearly sparked by some of the controversies, in particular regarding Justice Thomas accepting gifts, Justice Alito engaging, or his family members engaging in certain kind of political activity. But also there's some from the left. There's that thing about Justice Sotomayor flogging her children's books, which was not great either. Though again, it's not entirely clear like what an enforceable code of conduct would be for justices and like who would enforce it. But you have this proposal on the table. So first question, I do want to spend most of the time talking about the merits of this thing, but before we do that, it is July. I guess it'll be August once this drops. It is like August of an election year in a hugely polarized country where the Supreme Court is also hugely polarized. So this is like not happening. Like if you thought COSA was going to have a hard time getting through Congress, right? This is not happening anytime soon. So what is the kind of political feasibility, even in the medium term, of this? And if it's low, was there any point to this? Or should we view this just purely as, like an intervention in the 2024 election to give Kamala Harris something to talk about? Quinta, let's start with you.
That is a point. Right. I think that there is a temptation. There was a bizarre op-ed from Erwin Chemerinsky in the New York Times, I think, basically saying, well, the real thing that's important is for the Democrats to win in November if you care about the Constitution, which, like, my man, yes, that's why they're doing this. Like, the point, if your argument is that the court has strayed from its sort of institutional foundations and needs to be brought more into alignment with the constitutional structure as a whole, and also into alignment with sort of small d democratic values, then campaigning on a proposal to do that is part of that process, right? Both in that it gives the Democrats, like just in terms of raw politics, it gives the Democrats the ability to campaign on that proposal and sort of harness the discontent with the Supreme Court that I think really kicked into drive after Dobbs and has only continued to grow and grow, and means that, if they win, they will have a mandate to push forward with that. That doesn't mean that it won't be hard, but I do think that saying like, oh, well, they'll need a constitutional amendment, so like, what's the point, is sort of missing the point that I think that what this is part of shifting the ground from a sort of pure quote unquote, constitutional interpretation, constitutional revision to a matter of politics in every sense, right? Institutional politics, democratic politics, constitutional politics. And that is the goal here, is sort of suddenly moving the the composition of the Supreme Court, the question of term limits, into something that can be discussed as a matter, in the political arena. And even if it doesn't result in any reforms or amendments, to put pressure on the justices or on the far right to back down. And this is a dynamic that I think is, familiar to anyone who learned about the switch in time, the New Deal in high school, right? But I think that it's a mistake to kind of look at this and say, oh, well, there's no way that they could get the 2/3 necessary for an amendment. Like, the point is getting people talking about it and being seen as fighting for it.
So I totally agree with your point that, like, look, this stuff takes time. It takes more than a week, and you have to start at some point. I guess my question is more, does anyone care about this, right? I think one criticism often leveled against Democrats, and especially like pointy-headed people like the three of us, right? Like law professors and journalists and people who like work at lawfare, like those are people. It's like, we really care about these sort of small d like we really think that Trump's autocracy matters and the separation of powers matters, and we should all be talking about that. But politically, like, most people care more about inflation or healthcare or some culture war issues.
What's healthcare? What's healthcare? Abortion access. No. I think this is important. Is that what the court did in Dobbs is it moved kind of abstract questions about the institutional balance of power into the very,
is that your law professor voice?
Yes, that's what I would sound like.
That's how I lecture all the time.
And very, very visibly into the day-to-day lives of millions and millions of people. People are really mad about Dobbs. That is not me projecting. We saw that in 2022. We see that in the Supreme Court's approval ratings. They're mad about Dobbs, and they're, not everyone, obviously, but a significant block of voters, mad about Dobbs and scared about what's going to come next in terms of contraception, right? Whether gay marriage is on the chopping block, all kinds of things. Birthright citizenship, right? Like, who the hell knows? And so I do think that there is a way that this could have been sort of abstract in a way that wouldn't really connect with people. But I actually think that the court's rulings have kind of brought it into people's daily life in a way that is really visceral and that turns a lot of people off. I also think I was surprised by how widespread the revulsion to the Trump immunity ruling was. And that I would have put in the category of like, who cares? But like, people were really mad about it. I saw people talking about it who I would not have expected. People were mad about Loper Bright. Right? Like, this Barbara Streisand had a tweet about how Loper Bright was there was a piece in Vogue, right? Like, I think that the court
Don't get me started on like Loper Bright vibes in public. Like, people who like Chevron are just a little
right.
Like,
no. I'm not saying that all of this is 100% aligned with what, we would think about those cases. But I am saying that the court and the changes that the court is sort of making to American society through its rulings have really, I think, permeated the public discourse in a way that is new. Like, my go-to example about this is like, remember the Barbie movie? The Barbie movie had a joke about the Kens appointing appellate judges. And in the theater that I was in, there was howling with laughter. And I was sitting there thinking,
that was a legitimately funny line.
But like, it was funny and people got it. And I just think that the landscape of public relationship with the court has really changed over the last few years.
Let me ask you though, how many miles was the movie theater in which you saw Barbie from the Supreme Court? I mean, you did see Barbie and it did seem, I just want to point out, there's like a little bit of a selection effect there.
It is definitely true, but, it was written into the script. Someone decided it was funny enough to keep it. People thought it was funny, right? Like,
I mean, I will say that the audience in the Minnesota theater in which I saw Barbie also laughed. So I think that's maybe better.
How many
that's
miles
the better
was that
data
from
point.
The Supreme
It was
Court,
very
Alan?
far. It was right now. So you are
after
right.
they yelled "Go Vikings." But so I think I do want to point out my hot take here, and I'm sorry, I'm going to probably inflame some folks here. I think we are missing the actor who deserves the most blame, and that is to say, Congress. The fact that Congress is not bearing more of a responsibility for whether or not you like the Supreme Court, Congress has tremendous power to shape the Supreme Court. And first and foremost, the power I want to point out is its docket. People don't pay attention to the judge's bill. It's understandable because it's 99 years old. But 99 years ago, Chief Justice Taft swindled Congress and said, hey, give us more or less carte blanche authority over what cases to select. And he said, don't worry, we'll use objective criteria. We'll still make sure we have a robust and lengthy caseload so that we're addressing the most important topics. And Congress said, cool beans. We like Taft. Go forth and prosper. 99 years later, for 5 consecutive terms, the court has decided fewer than 60 cases. They're just not doing their job from a merely day-to-day function point of view. So I think Congress bears some responsibility there. Their docket, the Supreme Court's docket, is within Congress's bailiwick.
And not just docket, but also jurisdiction. I mean, a lot of stuff that could be done with jurisdiction stripping, and it's odd why liberals who you could remove abortion from the court's jurisdiction and see what happens.
You could remove jurisdiction, or, I mean, this is going to sound radical, you could have passed legislation in the 40 years between Roe and Dobbs. So I think that I'm worried that we're jumping to how can we blow up the court structure as we know it today, when there are lesser steps we can take that are more within the current constitutional bounds that could have a meaningful effect on the Supreme Court. I
guess so, but are we really, are any of these proposals that radical? And I mean, I do want to talk about the substance of them a little bit. I mean, to me, the one that would have by far the biggest impact would be the 18-year fixed term, right? I mean, I guess you could overrule Trump versus United States. I don't know. I've always been of the view that whatever you think about the case, the threat to American democracy fundamentally comes from people being willing or not to vote on an authoritarian, and not what the specific contours of that authoritarian's post-presidential criminal immunity is going to be. And then as to the ethics code, I will admit they should tighten up. Some of the stuff that Thomas is doing with the gifts is not great, legitimately problematic. And I think he probably should have recused from some of the subpoena stuff that kind of touched on his wife, Jenny Thomas. I think by contrast, the Alito stuff is absurdly overblown, and liberals are just straight up embarrassing themselves with the Alito flag stuff, which they just don't like Sam Alito. Fine, you don't have to like Sam Alito, but just cool it with the nonsense on that. But again, I don't think the ethics thing is again that fundamental to the Supreme Court structure. I don't think Thomas would be any less of a extremely far right justice if he took one fewer trips from Harlan Crow. To me, it's the 18-year term limit that is by far the most important. And you're right, Kevin, that it would be a fundamental change to the structure of the Supreme Court. I mean, fundamental in the sense that Article 3, very much provides for life tenure, and 18 years is not life tenure. But I honestly have to say, I have yet to hear a single good argument against an 18-year term, right? Now, maybe, the devil's in the details. Is it 18 years? How do you deal with the current justices? Do you do it by amendment? Do you do it by, there are lots of details there, but is it really that controversial that, the United States would be such a better place if durable political majorities could over a long period of time gradually shift? I mean, that just seems so much healthy, so much healthier. Now, I'm not saying that means it's likely to pass, right? Though, at the end of the day, I don't know. I mean, I could imagine a world in which it's structured in such a way as to preserve the current Republican majority for a while, right? So the Republicans would feel like that they have to give anything up. And that frankly, if the Republicans can alter their coalition so that they feel confident that, they can over time win approximately 50% of elections, and I see no reason why they should ever be a permanent minority party. I don't know why it wouldn't be in their interest as well, given that, as they discovered with the Warren Court, a liberal court can be just as offensive to conservatives over a long period of time as a conservative court can be offensive to liberals. But, sorry, I think it's a very long-winded way of saying, can't we all agree on 18 years?
Ideally, yes, but unfortunately, no.
I agree that it's fundamental in the terms of, like you pointed out, Alan, we would have to obviously change the Constitution. But with respect to the values that we want from a life term, I think you generally realize those with 18 years in terms of the development of expertise, in terms of the independence. And for a minute, I was thinking, well, that 17th year, watch out, because they're going to go crazy, right? Well, we're already seeing justices plan their departures now in a way that you could also see them decide, okay, this is my last year. Now I'm going to go off the wheels or whatever you're going to say. So that's more or less destroying my own argument against it. My concern, though, still is that what I want to caution against is this increasing tendency to frame the Supreme Court as a body that's supposed to be like representative of the people necessarily, or of certain values, or of political parties in some sense, and instead recognize that it was intended to be an independent institution. And I think it's important to make sure we don't conflate the idea that justices are supposed to be responsive to some sort of political community or political faction. And I see that seeping more and more into the discourse around the court, is saying, the justices are out of touch. Oh, the justices aren't responsive to my values or their values or whatever. And that's because the justices don't have constituents.
Well, but I think it's a trade-off, right? Because you can either, like in a democracy, you can either have a Supreme Court that has very broad policymaking authority and is representative, or a Supreme Court that has very little policymaking authority and can be as independent and unrepresentative as possible. But you can't have both. But you can't have what we have right now, which is a Supreme Court that essentially acts as a supra legislature, right? A third and frankly more powerful house of Congress that decides all of our most important issues, right? Which, by the way, this isn't a left-right thing, right? If you're on the left, you're pissed about Dobbs. If you're on the right, you're pissed about, gay marriage, right? Like everyone has their thing that they think the Supreme Court has usurped from them, and they are totally legitimate in having that thing, or in being pissed about that. You can't have that and non-representativeness. I mean, you can, but at some point, the contradictions are heightened, as the Marxists would say. So, yeah, but you have to choose one of those things. And the thing, Kevin, I like about your point is, I think what you're reminding us of is that there's a lot that Congress could do to tell the court, you can have your independence, right? But you're going to do a lot less, right? You're going to do a lot less, in part through jurisdiction stripping, in some ways by doing a lot more of like the kind of boring resolving circuit splits, right? Because you don't have control over your docket anymore. You can't just do your fun con law cases all day long. But where I fundamentally agree with Biden is that I do think the current status quo is not super tolerable.
Anytime you have an entire branch of government receiving such low approval ratings, if we want to have our democracy survive, it's contingent upon trust in institutions and approval of those institutions. And if we see that steadily eroding and there's no suggestion of a change, then yeah, something's got to give. And so my urge for scholars, for pundits, for Twitter folks is to just realize that, to your point, Alan, there needs to be a broader conversation about the mechanisms available, and perhaps a broader focus on the most readily available mechanisms. Docket reform, in my opinion, should be at the top of the headlines. Every law professor loves writing on the centennial anniversary of blah, 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 blah. Now's the time. Judge's Bill turns 100 next year. Get your articles going. Let's have 400 symposiums.
Dude, I think you have your next law review article.
I will say my favorite reform proposal is make them ride circuit on actual horses.
On actual horses. Yeah. Yeah.
In all seriousness, I mean, I think that the way that I read this, at least, is that it is an opening salvo meant to kind of open the conversation. And that if you start from a position of 18-year terms and maybe end up with no 18-year terms, but limiting jurisdiction, or exerting more control over the docket or something like that, then it's still kind of in the same category. Again, if we understand this as sort of the opening salvo in a longer political conversation rather than, this is the proposal.
And my only wish was that the administration had set this forth earlier, right after the commission was finished, for example. It's far less politically palatable when it comes out the day or 2 days after whatever you announce you're no longer running for president. It's hard not to see that as an election move. But if this had come out mid-administration, I think it would have perhaps received slightly more bipartisan support.
We will end it there, but of course, this would not be rational security if we did not do object lessons. Alan, what do you have for us?
So my wife is an amazing gardener. I mean, she has like quite a green thumb, and we're lucky we have like a pretty big backyard. And we just have like a lot of vegetable patches and platforms and stuff. The only downside of this is that there's usually a part of the summer season, which is actually quite lovely in Minnesota, where you get like 10 pounds of cucumbers a day that you have to harvest. And although like I can basically just subsist off of cucumbers, like there are days where like most of my water consumption just comes from eating cucumbers because they're really good when they're fresh. At some point it's too much even for me, but we have discovered an amazing recipe for just grinding through cucumbers, which is cucumber agua fresca. So basically you take a bunch of cucumbers, you throw them in a high powered blender, you turn it on. They're mostly water. You add a little bit of ginger, some lime juice, and some sweetener like agave or something. And then you want to pour it through like a fine mesh strainer and then pour it over ice cubes. It is unbelievably good. So if you are in the position that I have of just having an embarrassment of cucumbers to work through, or you just want to go to your grocery store or your local farmer's market, because I know you like bougie urban people can do that with your lattes and your whatever. Go make a cucumber agua fresca. It's really good. It's really good. I mean, I feel like watermelon agua fresca is the agua fresca people usually go for, which is also delicious, but cucumber agua fresca is fabulous. I mean, there are recipes online, but like you don't need a recipe. It's you just put stuff in a blender and taste.
I like that you made fun of us for being bougie with our farmers markets while talking about your backyard cucumbers.
Right. The man with a house and a backyard calls out the coastal elite.
You have a backyard?
Yeah, right.
It's fair. It's nice.
All right, Kevin, over to you.
So I will steer clear of the territory I am not allowed to go and instead celebrate.
Have you seen this movie Twisters? It's really good. Glenn Powell is you should that should be your object lesson, Kevin.
It's got me spinning.
Oh, boy.
Pun intended. But I am rarely known for my music taste. I mean, I did call the song of the summer. Everyone's listening to Espresso. Everyone loves Sabrina Carpenter. So I am proud of that. No one else could have seen that coming. But there's a new song out. It's called Cowboys Cry 2. And it's got Kelsey Ballerini and my man, Noah Kahan. So here's the thing about Noah Kahan. He and I connected. He doesn't know this, but he and I connected like 10 years ago. I found him when I was just in the dorms in Eugene at good old University of Oregon, going way too hard on college homework while everyone else was having a fun time. And Noah got me through some boring writing assignments, and I became Team Kahan like 10 years ago. And now this guy's just blowing up. And I couldn't be more proud of him because we grew up together. Again, he doesn't know this, but we really have a strong tie. And so it's just great to see your kids thrive and prosper. So everyone go listen to Cowboys Cry 2, because it also pairs nicely with a viewing of Twisters.
That was an illegal Twisters reference. That's ruled out. I will recommend a movie that does not have Glenn Powell in it, even a little bit. It is called I Saw the TV Glow. It came out earlier this year. I do not really like horror movies. I am a big wimp. I saw this described as horror, more sort of psychological horror. I would say that it is about being really, really, really into a TV show or any piece of media, really. But it's specifically about two kids who are big fans of a TV show in the 90s, and sort of, I think, is trying to recreate the feeling of what that is like. There are a lot of different ways to read it. The director is transgender. I think there's a way to read the movie that is maybe the most natural way, that is about the main character's gender identity. I think you can also just read it as like what it's like to be a really big fan of a television show or a movie or a book series or something like that, specifically, when you're a kid and in high school. Highly, highly recommend it. It is just beautiful to look at. The cinematography is amazing, and it has a great soundtrack. So I Saw the TV Glow.
Are there any worms?
I don't think there are worms, but it is kind of a weird movie, so I would not be surprised if there was a worm that I had forgotten about. Let's put it that way. All right. That brings us to the end of this week's episode. Rational Security is, of course, a production of Lawfare. Be sure to visit lawfaremedia.org for our show page with links to past episodes, and for our written work and the written work of other Lawfare contributors, and for information on Lawfare's other podcast series, including The Aftermath. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at RATL Security and leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening. And sign up to be a material supporter of Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo. Our music was performed by Sophia Yan, and we were edited by the wonderful Jen Patja. On behalf of my co-host Alan and our special guest Kevin Frazier, I'm Quinta Jurecic, and we'll talk to you next week. Until then, goodbye.